To the leadership of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Marwala and the Executive Leadership Group, to the ministers here present, the MECs, I may not have seen everyone from government, to the family of Mzala, Mpo, the parents, the sister, the children, the family. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, a very, very good evening to you. A very good evening to you. This being a serious evening, my intention is to keep it exactly that, serious. However, I cannot not wish you a happy Valentine's Day. And thanking you for sharing the Valentine's Day with us. And I'm sure you will agree with me that it doesn't always happen that love and politics, as in tonight, always meet in the color red, but such is the occasion this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to call upon Professor Marwala, the man of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, to come and welcome you and to also make his remarks. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. I will not be talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Thank you very much for coming. We do understand that you have braved quite a vicious rain. And of course, because of ESCOM, the lights are not working. So the traffic is actually not working as effectively. So I would like to first acknowledge the presence of Professor Sheehan. She's actually a visiting professor at the University of Cape Town. So I was reminding her how much she's missing by not being at the University of Johannesburg. We're going to extend an invitation for you to actually come to University of Johannesburg much more than you come to University of Cape Town. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of the council member. He has worn many hats here at the University of Johannesburg. He was a deputy chair of council also, trade unionist, member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party, Mr. Frans Baleni. Thank you very much, Siyabonga. I also would like to acknowledge the family of Mzala. We are grateful for you to come and basically celebrate the ideas that Mzala actually stood for. I also would like to thank Professor Ndlovu Gacheni. He is at the University of South Africa, but I don't think he's going to be there for too long. He is a visiting professor here at the University of Johannesburg for the entire year. Mr. Stolle, and also other board members of the Mzala Nxumalo Foundation. And most especially to our students, because really we do these things so that we can be able to transfer knowledge. Societies that do not engage with ideas ultimately die. So when we see you here, we absolutely appreciate, because it actually gives us hope that our future indeed is going to be quite robust. So we are here today at the University of Johannesburg for the Mzala Nxumalo Lecture. I never met Mzala. But Mzala was one of the leading ANC intellectuals of the 1976 generation. In fact, if you talk about the intellectuals of that generation, I think Mzala would actually be the first amongst those. And Mzala was a man who believed in education. He was about to finish his PhD, isn't it? at the time of his death at the University of Essex and the Open University, and he was planning to take a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale University. And I understand he wanted to write a book on O.R. Tambo. He was a formidable and dedicated writer. I first encountered Mzala's work in London when I was 17 years old, in 1989. I know some of you are looking at my beard. You think I was 17 years old in 1981. When I was attending the London International Youth Science Fortnight. Of course, Mzala is famous for the book, Wongani. You know the book that I'm talking about. Wongani is from Mahlabatini. And he does care quite a great deal about his own safety. As a young boy, of the age of 17, dreaming about how I will use my then not yet acquired scientific knowledge to take the African continent from underdevelopment to developed state, I was inspired by Mzala's writings. Mzala was a leader who believed in ideas and who knew his ideas. And Levi, those who do not know must not lead. Mzala was a scientific socialist and was a skilled Marxist. And he understood how to use Marx's tools of analysis. One of his celebrated work was a paper titled, and I quote, Cooking the Rice Inside the Pot, close quote. And by the way, it was not about the rice. What he was basically saying was that the war against oppression must happen in South Africa. As a revolutionary internationalist, his other work was a paper titled Cooking the Rice Outside the Pot, where he was emphasizing the need for international solidarity to defeat apartheid. I do know this much, that Mzala was not a physicist, Professor Sheehan, and therefore was not as well versed in Max Planck's theory of quantum mechanics, which basically states that an object can occupy two states at the same time. Of course, quantum theory is an antithesis of scientific determinism, which is really the underlying theory that Marxism is based on. Scientific determinism is basically, a theory that believes that everything can be understood by analyzing the causes, the chain of causes and effects. And Mzala was interested in the national question, which is an antithesis of quantum thinking, where an individual can occupy multiple identities all at the same time. So in quantum thinking, you can actually cook the same rice inside and outside the same pot at the same time. This is what scientists call dual nature of being. And for those of us who are scientists will know that, the famous perception of light, that it has dual nature, it is both a particle and a wave at the same time. I actually think science is beautiful, and we should study it to liberate ourselves economically, politically, and socially. Now, why is cooking the same rice inside and outside the same pot at the same time an important concept of our times? A few weeks ago, we learned that the embassies of the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Germany, United States, and Switzerland wrote to our president to complain about corruption in our country. I think this is almost an intention of colonization of a special type. What was startling to me was not that they wrote those letters. What was startling to me was that 75% of our foreign direct investment actually comes from those 5 countries. This means that our economic growth and our economic ambition are actually being cooked outside the pot by outside cooks. I almost said crooks. For example, we assemble cars such as Mercedes-Benz here in Port Elizabeth in South Africa. But the parts of these cars are actually manufactured outside South Africa. So to use Mzala's allegory, we are serving the rice that was cooked outside the pot. As we move forward in our long march towards economic emancipation, we ought to find ways and the right economic policies that will move us forward. There are two ways that we can be able to use to mobilize resources for investment into our economy. Of course, we cannot discount external forces, but we should also use internal forces in order to invest in our economy. It is said that South African corporations are sitting on a cash pile of 1 trillion rands, which is just sitting, not being invested. At the same time, the South African economy is very dependent on outside investors for economic growth. For this reason, South Africa is extremely concerned about how it is viewed by the international investors. Whatever we do, we always ask ourselves, what are the international investors saying? Appropriation of land without compensation, of course, is another thing that investors are challenging us. When the Chinese paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, was modernizing China, he realized that for China to succeed, it will have to open to the outside world. The story that is often told is that when the Chinese leadership was deciding in 1978 how they were going to open up to the world, Deng Xiaoping had a map, and he took a pen and circled around a rural area in China called Shenzhen and called it a special economic zone. And this special economic zone, in his mind, was there to serve as a magnet for outside economic investment. In addition, Deng realized that there was a need to capacitate China internally. He invested in education. He invested in education in a period where education did not exist in China for 15 years during the Cultural Revolution. He also invested in strong leadership. In this regard, and I know my student leaders will be quite excited about this, Deng stated that China's leaders should be younger and should be more educated. So F7s are not acceptable. Today, Shenzhen, with a population of 12 million people, is a $640 billion economy, richer than South Africa with a population of 55 million people. At the same time, here in South Africa, we are introducing special economic zones. And the question that we need to ask is whether these economic zones will have enough economic gravity to attract investments and economically transform our people. The first thing that we need to do, now I'm coming to my closure, is to invest in our people. For us to be able to attract investment, whether domestic or foreign, we will need to overcome certain obstacles that stand on our ways. The first obstacle is the crisis of lack of high-level skills. In South Africa, we actually need technical skills. South Africa, with a population of 55 million, actually only produces 1,500 engineers per year. I'm talking about engineers who have bachelor's degrees. Half of those engineers actually leave the profession within a very short space of time. Many of them end up in banks. Monopoly capital, Emajav. Often, the argument that is put forward is whether it makes sense for us to heavily invest in education if people are not getting jobs. To me, I think this is a secular argument. Because without skills, we will never produce sufficient jobs. Whereas without jobs, we will never have sufficient interest from our people to pursue learning. Whatever the circumstances are, we have to educate our people. Of course, Mzala lived in a different era to ours. There was no internet, and the Soviet Union still existed during his time. Now we are in the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And Mzala understood objects in their totality and would have cautioned us that as we prepare for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we should not forget to contextualize it within the broader framework of industrialization. To paraphrase Mzala, he would have firmly understood that the Fourth Industrial Revolution should be cooked inside industrialization. He would have understood that the aim of any technological change is to modernize the productive forces. He would have understood that education is the only motive force that will capacitate us to participate in the Fourth Industrial Revolution and eliminate poverty, unemployment, and inequality. He would have understood Deng Xiaoping when he said, and I quote, "To uphold socialism, we must eliminate poverty. Poverty is not socialism," close quote. He would have understood that modernizing our productive forces requires skills. And this is why I always tell the students that the library should be your friend. In order to build leadership in our people, it is important to look for viable international examples. The British with their Brexit, most of their politicians study something called PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. This, of course, allows graduates to be skilled in the art of political willing and dealing, as we have seen with the Brexit, understand the economic and financial systems, and have adequate philosophical training to understand big issues of our time. The world has changed, and the leaders whom we must train should understand politics for sure. But they should also understand economics and technology. In this regard, the University of Johannesburg is introducing a course called Politics, Economics, and Technology. So that we can prepare our leaders for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. To paraphrase Deng Xiaoping, our leaders must be younger and must understand politics, economics, and technology. Ngiyabonga, Baya Danki, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Marwala, for the rich introduction. I don't want to say it's going to be a hard act to follow, but it's going to be some act to follow. And well, he has laid the stake on the ground. I don't know whether the library is the pot. I'm sure it's not the rice. But I think that there is rice to be cooked inside or outside the pot. at the same time. Professor Helena Sheehan, I'm going to be calling upon you. I hope you will not mind if we project your bio over there. And then as you speak already, I think people have a sense of who you are. You've traveled all the way from Dublin, and welcome to the university, as the professor has said. So please, over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome that I've received this evening. I thank colleagues at University of Johannesburg and comrades for the at the Mzala Center for the honor of being invited to give this lecture. I hope to address you in a way that honors the legacy of Mzala, as well as the liberation movement that came to power with an agenda of academic transformation. I wish to speak here not only as an academic, but as an activist, as Mzala always did, as I pursue questions that mattered to Mzala, but that he was not given the chance to pursue further in the momentous decades that have unfolded since he died. As a student, I studied the canonical history of philosophy. When I became active on the left, and especially when I became a Marxist, I had to go through it all again and reassess it from a new perspective, which meant embedding it in socio-historical context and interrogating it in a whole new way. As a university teacher, I also taught it, always in socio-historical context, and never as an internalist history with one philosopher taking up the agenda and arguments of the other without reference to the culture, politics, and economics of the times. After I went through this canonical history, going from the pre-Socratics to postmodernism, I asked students to go back on this history and to note who is present and who is absent, to ask what Africans, females, proletarians should make of what could be seen as a Eurocentrist, male, elite history, a history produced by a class structure in which some engaged in the pursuit of higher knowledge, while others labored from below to feed, clothe, and shelter them. When I first had the opportunity to come to South Africa in 2001, I thought this would be the ideal atmosphere for pursuing my thinking about these questions further. Here are the initial questions I set for myself. In the canonical narrative about the history of knowledge, who are the players? Who are the insiders and who are the outsiders? How did it come to be? What happens when the outsiders start to come inside? Is it enough to include those who have been excluded? Or has knowledge itself been tainted by the exclusions of race, class, gender, and colonial conquest? If the history of philosophy, if the whole history of knowledge has been shaped by the worldview of those who held power, do we renounce the history of philosophy, the history of science, the history of culture that's evolved until now, and start over? Or is it possible to engage in a critical reconstruction of the intellectual inheritance of the ages? Can academic disciplines be transformed? How? How is this tension playing itself out in contemporary academe? What is the role of philosophy, sociology, history, etc. in this transformation? How has it been registered in debates called the theory wars, the culture wars, the science wars? What's going on in current debates about African philosophy and feminist epistemology? How do movements such as Afrocentrism and ecofeminism come into play? And how does all this relate to positivism, postmodernism, and historical materialism? Do our patterns of thinking need to be fundamentally recast? And how was a liberation movement come to power here in South Africa with an agenda of academic transformation addressing these issues? Or, I wondered, would all of this be marginalized beyond caring as the marketization of university proceeds? So, how did it come to be? The history of knowledge is rooted in the social division of labor, according to class, race, and gender. In primitive societies, all labor was required to produce the material means of subsistence. As development advanced, the social division of labor became ever more specialized and complex. In the separation of manual and mental labor, higher knowledge was confined to an elite. So a series of profound cleavages run through the history of knowledge, along the fault lines opened by the exclusions of class, race, and gender. However, there have also been forces for the democratization of knowledge. From the challenge to feudal authority by the ascendant bourgeoisie, through the liberation movements of the past century, to whatever outposts of progressive thought and challenges to neoliberalization of universities that exist today. In terms of gender, the social division of labor has cut deeply into the process of knowing, most overtly through the historical exclusion of women from the very process of philosophy, science, politics, etc., but also, more subtly, through the psychological severing of personality according to gender, such that masculinity was defined as rational, theoretical, scientific, and political, while femininity was defined as emotional, experiential, personal, and domestic. Knowledge has developed in terms of sharp and false dichotomies between what was identified as masculine and feminine, bringing the dominance of what were considered to be masculine characteristics within the process of knowing itself, leading to a distorted conception of rationality. In terms of race, a similar bifurcation of basic characteristics was attributed along racial lines to justify colonial conquest and the social division of labor and distribution of resources stemming from that. Europeans were logical and scientific, the master of advanced political, economic, and technical prowess, whereas Africans were more primitive, more tribal, closer to the earth, more spiritual, less rational, more suited to till the land than to rule it, more prone to excel in song, dance, and other forms of culture than in the pursuit of higher knowledge. But it's not just in terms of Europe and Africa. Even within Europe, similar stereotypes prevailed between North and South of Europe, and even now they form the characterization of Germany versus Greece. Even in terms of Northern Europe, there's similar characterization of England versus Ireland along similar lines. But the point is, it is always, always, always the legacy of conquest, of the social division of labor and distribution of resources. In terms of class, the most basic of divisions, structuring the social division of labor and distribution of resources, structuring the right to rule, to consume what others have produced, and to access and define higher knowledge. This was historically confined to a tiny elite of the world's population, while the rest labored from below to serve their interests. Those who ruled were characterized as having both superior entrepreneurial skill and intellectual acumen to dominate the economy, politics, education, and institutions of civil society, while those who labored from below to produce the material means of existence were characterized as fit only for manual labor. As with gender, race, and ethnicity, it shaped not only access to knowledge, but the very constitution of knowledge. However, these patterns have not gone uncontested. The liberation movements of the past 2 centuries have challenged not only existing structures of power, but prevailing patterns of thought. Bertolt Brecht's great poem, Questions from a Worker Who Reads, has been a powerful manifestation of history from below. I'm not going to take the time to read it now, but I recommend that you Google it and read it. It's a very, very powerful declaration of the right to reformulate history from a completely different point of view. These movements have not only had political consequences, but intellectual consequences. These movements have brought not only demands for inclusion of the excluded, but have raised far-reaching questions about the nature of knowledge produced by those who have been included. The history of knowledge has come to be perceived as shaped by the worldview of those who held power. It has reflected the experiences and interests of a tiny elite of the world's population. Therefore, all existing knowledge has been tainted and distorted by the exclusions of class, race, gender, and imperial power. I propose that we look at this process in terms of a dialectic of struggle from oppression to liberation. Those who are outsiders to the dominant forms of social power first demand inclusion, more or less within existing structures of power and modes of thought. This is marked by an epistemology of empiricism and a politics of liberalism. Then comes the realization that patriarchy, racism, capitalism, imperialism have shaped the very essence of the social order and have even penetrated to the very core of personality. Therefore, for women to adopt male modes of working, thinking, writing will not do anymore. Rationality itself is seen as distorted through its association with the male experience of the world and the exclusion of the female. This is the impulse to negation, rejection, and separatism. Ironically, although its impulse is to repudiate, it ends up by reinforcing the existing division of labor and the psychosocial severing of human personality, often essentializing and romanticizing the characteristics ascribed by the colonizer. For example, seeing Africa as a locus of superior human essence, whereby Africans are intuitive, holistic, communal, cosmological, connected to land and ancestors, whereas Europeans are logical, fragmented, calculating, individualist, and materialist. It's marked by an epistemology of romanticist irrationalism or social constructivism, a politics of separatism, and destruction of postmodernist fragmentation and nihilism. A further stage is to reappropriate and reconstruct the history of knowledge from the position of a new realization. As I see it, these are the basic positions in debates over the constitution of knowledge: conservatism, liberalism, postmodernism, historical materialism. Assuming, as those of my generation did in the 1960s, that all was not well, and that our universities needed to deal with the issues raised by movements highlighting the exclusions, deceptions, and oppressions of patriarchy, racism, and colonialism, we rejected the conservative position. What then? What about the liberal position? First, there is the inclusion of the excluded. Our universities today are inhabited by a very different population than inhabited them in the past. In much of the world from the 1960s and in South Africa from the 1990s, many students and staff were the descendants of the excluded in class, race, and gender terms. Many were happy just to get there and not to question what they found there. Not that all is sorted even on the level of inclusion, despite all that's been achieved. When I first came to South Africa, I witnessed many protests against financial exclusion, and I see them still happening now, with turbulent confrontations and even fatal consequences. Nevertheless, many of us who came to universities from which our ancestors were excluded, at first wide-eyed and accepting, began to raise questions, coming not only from our own development of critical consciousness, but from the social movements of our times. In my case, from the 1960s New Left in the United States. Here we come to the larger and deeper issue of the rise of the repressed. We engaged in questioning that went to the very theoretical foundations of traditional disciplines, as well as bringing new fields into being. We demanded history from below, Black studies, women's studies, labor studies. We were infuriated at academic conferences when our elders proclaimed the value neutrality of philosophy, sociology, history, economics, and science. We talked long into the night, questioning the dogmas of church, state, and capital. We examined our existing worldviews and constructed new ones. We won many victories, and universities are very different today as a result. And this is still happening in universities all over the world, and specifically here in South Africa. So here are the steps, or the alternative paths in that process. On race, add Black history to white history. Revise the dominant story to include the African origins of the species and early African civilizations. To take a critical view of slavery, colonization, and unequal terms of trade. To celebrate African identity. Add Black writers to the curriculum. Regarding gender, find female writers and thinkers worth reading. Praise diversity and think the problem is solved. About class, add labor history. See the world from the perspective of those who labored from below to grow food, build cities, teach children, heal the sick. But the further we push in telling an alternative story, the more it generates critique and sometimes even revulsion when we confront the silences, the deceit, the theft, the exploitation. It's good to learn of Hypatia of Alexandria, but such women who managed to find a foothold in higher knowledge were of a privileged class, and it does not solve the problem of the silences on the stage of history. Finding some female or Black thinkers in history to add to the story is good, but it does not redress the absence of my class, my gender, your race from the production of knowledge itself. We are descended from a great silence. How many Black women cleaning South African universities over the decades might have had the capacity to study, to teach, and to write? This sadly we'll never know. It's a silence, it's an absence, and it's a great tragedy. But it still needs to be addressed. Such realization leads to rage against epistemicide, to negate the whole edifice of Eurocentric, patriarchal, capitalist knowledge, to reinterpret the whole of history from an Afrocentrist or feminist point of view, to affirm a new modus operandi based on racial or gender specificity. There are a number of historical movements I could cite in how all this is played out. Prolet cult in the early days of the Soviet Union, the Maoist Cultural Revolution, certain forms of Afrocentrism and radical feminism. However, I'm going to focus on the most recent and relevant one here. That is, Rhodes must fall, leading to fees must fall. From the first day I set foot on the UCT campus, I was appalled by the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, its presiding position on the campus, and the lack of contestation of this. Rhodes was a symbol not only of white supremacy, but of colonial conquest, capitalist expropriation, and ruthless class rule. Every time I passed it, and I did it many times a day over a course of many months, over years, every time I passed it, I cringed. One day, I took a photo, the photo on the top of this slide, as I heard a UCT student, a Black female student, showing incoming students around campus, stopping at the Rhodes statue and explaining, "We honor him for giving us all this." I wanted to scream that it was not his to give and ask how, in this time in history, students could be so blinded by false consciousness. But of course, it wasn't my place to do that. I constantly raised the question of Rhodes with various colleagues at UCT and even comrades in the SACP, none of whom seemed quite as agitated about it as I was. They agreed with my critique of Rhodes, but said it was only a statue, and it didn't matter all that much. I thought of what I would like to see happen to the statue of Rhodes. Of course, the options of smashing it or putting it in a museum had their merits, but what I thought would be a good idea would be to contextualize it, to build all around it a representation of the class structure of the Cape Colony over which he so oppressively presided. However, nobody seemed very interested in my idea. When I heard of Rhodes Must Fall, I was delighted. I followed them on various media from a distance in Ireland. If I'd been in Cape Town, I would have rushed out to support them. In these two photos, you can see the transition from liberal inclusion to radical contestation. I was especially impressed that these activists made the point that it was about more than the statue, that it was connected to demands for a drastic decolonization of the curriculum. There were occupations and teach-ins and a radical raising of consciousness of those involved. There was a probing of the relation between race, class, and gender. There was support for workers' demands on outsourcing, wages, and working conditions on campus. I was fascinated by South African universities and the sometimes very jolting juxtapositions that I found. The whole UCT campus was a melange of mixed signals, of unreflective and unresolved contradictions, of ragbag eclecticism as well as considered syntheses. The names of buildings honored oppressors and oppressed alike. You could walk from the Steve Biko building across the Sissy Gould Plaza to the Oppenheimer Library to the Otto Beit building. You could see a mural celebrating education for women in Africa and a series of paintings depicting UCD in struggle. You could attend a lecture on poverty in the Nedbank room and study environmental science in the Shell building. These were not just names and symbols, of course, but a reflection of real forces in motion in unresolved contradictions in the university and in the society. Subsequent renaming has brought buildings named for Neville Alexander, A.C. Jordan, Sarah Bartman, and a chair named for Archie Muffaji. Here are photos that I took of progressive images on the campus of UCT. So I saw Rhodes Must Fall in the tradition of these radical impulses at UCT. So I was impressed by Rhodes Must Fall. However, there were more problematic aspects that began to emerge. For some, the realizations brought revulsion and demanded destruction. The inclusive beginning gave way to some tendencies to racial essentialism and separatism, negation of intellectual achievements and burning of public property, even progressive art, even those paintings which I showed on my previous slides. I can understand the burning of portraits of Jan Smuts and Edward, Prince of Wales, but why those paintings of Karase Mose, Richard Baholo? I don't understand this. Whenever I saw those paintings, I was very moved by them, and I felt that UCT and everybody connected with UCT should be proud of those paintings and what they represented. So in more general terms, what to do with this realization and revulsion? Must every black person condemn every white person for every manifestation of racism and colonialism since the beginning of time? Must every woman hold every man accountable for every act of patriarchy and misogyny? Must every person to come from the working class reject any contribution to the struggle against the injustice of class rule by anyone born into a more privileged class position? And this includes Marx and Engels, by the way. There is a difference between justified rage against injustice and an undiscriminating and unjustified backlash. Moreover, it will not lead to genuine liberation. It might set out to find a road to a just society, but it will not go there. It's a blind alley. It is seeking decolonization of the mind, but it will sink into a nihilistic swamp. Fanon saw Negritude, a retreat into past African glories, an emphasis on race and culture as opposed to class and socio-economic structures as a black hole. So how to proceed towards decolonization of the university? Do we reject all existing knowledge and start again at year zero? Do we idealize our own ancestors as earth mothers or sun people or salt of the earth workers, as bearers of a sagacity that will be the key to our 21st century lives? Specifically, what to do with the intellectual inheritance of the ages? What to do with the history of knowledge as it's come down to us? Some feminist voices here. Donna Haraway. Modern feminists have inherited our story in a patriarchal voice. Feminists have inherited knowledge through the paternal line. The word was Aristotle's, Galileo's, Bacon's, Linnaeus's, Darwin's. The flesh was woman's. Feminists have now entered debates on the nature and power of scientific knowledge with a new authority. Evelyn Fox Keller. The aim is the reclamation from within science of science as a human instead of a masculine project, and the renunciation of the division between emotional and intellectual labor that maintains science as a male preserve. So, the third step in this dialectical transformation, as I see it, the history of civilization, the history of culture, the history of science. This knowledge may have been produced from an oppressive division of labor by class, race, and gender, from a gulf between those who ruled and wrote from above and those who labored from below. But through this, our species has evolved and produced what imperfect forms of civilization and knowledge that we have. And that legacy belongs not only to those who designed the buildings, wrote the books, and conducted the experiments, but to those who gave birth and tilled the soil and built the cities. The civilization that has been built, the cities, the schools, the universities, the hospitals, all the advances in science and technology, all these belong to those who labored from below, without whom nothing could have happened. So I don't denounce Aristotle or Galileo or Shakespeare, but I see them in a socio-historical context, and I take from them what's of value within my transformed worldview. I believe it's irrational and nihilistic to denounce anything that's ever been produced by dead white European males, which includes Marx, Engels, Bukharin, Caldwell, Gramsci. That knowledge of the past cannot be taken just as it is, but analyzed, criticized, and recontextualized to construct a new synthesis. The dominant historiography of knowledge must be scrutinized and transcended to tell a more inclusive, integrated, and complex story. The story of the oppressed must be foregrounded, so that the history of colonialism is seen from the perspective of the colonized, to construct a history that is more honest, more complex, more inclusive. The lived experience of marginalized people has epistemic value and should take its place in the university curriculum, but should not be exempt from the demands of logic, evidence, contextualization, and perspective. It should be set upon sound theoretical foundations. It should not be the case that experience is female and theory is male, or that experience is black and theory is white. So in this process of transformation, I think that much has been achieved in making space for gender and race, although not so much for class. But we need to defend these achievements, which are coming under attack from the right, who caricature these efforts as grievance studies. However, we can defend these achievements most effectively by a robust critique of those manifestations that make it easy to caricature. Out-of-focus identity politics, especially those based on overblown microaggressions of the privileged, in safe spaces fenced off with trigger warnings, which divert attention from resources and resources from those who are most severely oppressed, are a problem. A reduction of comrades or colleagues who have something to contribute to a common cause to allies who must be silent and follow orders is neither progressive nor productive. You would think sometimes that the problem with the world is the very existence of white heterosexual cis males. It's vital to rise above myopic separatism, to see each thing in the fullness of its interactions. Intersectionality theory is a move to articulate the interconnections by calling attention to the ways in which race, class, and gender and other factors intersect. But it tends to understate the role of class. Also, it's ungrounded insofar as it fails to name the system shaping such intersections. Similarly, privilege theory tends to be concerned with confronting individuals to measure their inherited position on a moral calculus designed by those engaging in a race to the bottom to win the prize of being designated most oppressed, and they're most often the relatively privileged descendants of the most oppressed. Only Marxism, I want to argue, names the system and is capable of conceptualizing the totality of forces in their interactions with each other. I've engaged in the cultural wars of recent decades and often felt really exasperated at the one-sided caricatures in combat with each other. In the science wars, for example, what was too often missed was the synthesis that the Marxist tradition had long brought to bear on these dilemmas, affirming simultaneously the cognitive power of science as well as its socio-historical embeddedness and ideological dimensions. This meme articulates brilliantly how out of focus so much current thinking is about race, class, and gender. Why is there so much emphasis on gender, race, and ethnicity at the expense of class? Capitalism can accommodate increased focus on gender, race, and ethnicity to a point. Indeed, it must, because it's a complex system that needs to harness the skills of the previously excluded in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity, and even class. But the pressure is for that participation to be in the direction of assimilation. What the system cannot accommodate is a transformation of the mode of production, distribution, and exchange. And this is why class analysis is off the agenda for our ever more market-oriented universities, our universities which are ever more colonized, not so much by states as by capital. Capitalism is the most powerful force determining our possibilities of life. A person's relation to the means of production, distribution, and exchange structures their access to material resources, physical health, psychological well-being, and advanced knowledge. Only Marxism is capable of synthesis, of contextualizing each thing in relation to the others, of seeing the pattern of interaction of all forces in motion, of finding a way forward beyond the morass of the moment. We have to find our way within capitalism to something beyond it. And this means thinking systemically, which starts with naming the system. So, in how we relate to what's come from the past and making our way in the present, I stress that I'm talking about serious synthesis and not flaccid affirmations or opportunist eclecticism. I don't think it's an adequate response to Black Lives Matter to say all lives matter. And on the level of the history of knowledge, it's one thing for me to say I find something of value in Aristotle, and I see no problem in a university being named after Aristotle, as there is one in Thessaloniki. But Rhodes is another matter. It does not solve the problem of Rhodes to add Mandela and to come up with a Mandela-Rhodes Foundation. A UCT student who was awarded a Mandela-Rhodes Scholarship to study for an MPhil in Intercultural and Diversity Studies said that he believed that the scheme was designed for individuals who have in them a little Mandela and a little Rhodes. The very existence of the Mandela-Rhodes Foundation symbolizes the glossing over of glaring contradictions. It is one kind of response to the agenda of transformation, but it is not based on genuine synthesis. As Mandela framed it, the bringing together of these two names represents a symbolic movement in the closing of the historic circle, drawing together the legacy of reconciliation and leadership and that of entrepreneurship and education. I ask, what about the legacy of subjugation, of deceit, of silence, of theft, of poverty, of murder? How can this be reduced to entrepreneurship and education? What about the legacy of struggle, of longing for liberation, of striving for justice, of demanding redistribution of wealth? How can this be reduced to leadership and reconciliation? I came to South Africa looking for transformation of academic knowledge within the context of the transformation of society. I explored the promises and processes that have enveloped South African universities over the decades. I focused on the underlying assumptions shaping academic disciplines in the humanities, the debates contesting them, and the socio-political economic movements encompassing them. I traced the impact of Marxism, Africanism, postmodernism, and neoliberalism on the production of knowledge. I found much evidence of decolonizing, transformative thinking in South African universities and in the liberation movement during the period of the struggle against apartheid, especially due to the strong influence of Marxism at this time. Contrary to my expectations, it seemed more vibrant during the struggle against apartheid than in the post-apartheid period. A number of intellectuals who once articulated coherent positions as part of a collective struggle have been overpowered by neoliberalism, decentered by postmodernism, and demobilized for a movement for liberation transforming into a party of power. My conclusion was that South African universities are caught up in a complex field of forces where they're subject to conflicting pressures. The result is a state of contradictory transformations, one stemming from the politics of liberation and the other from the demands of the global market. South Africa has been swept along in global tides, and it often seems as if the latter predominates. Although the intellectual ferment of the liberation movement has dissipated, I don't think that it's disappeared. In fact, I think even this event tonight is evidence of that. I'm seeking to learn more about the ongoing process of transformation in South African universities during my time here, my 6th time in South Africa. So I thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Siyabonga, Professor Sheehan. As I'm listening to you, I can't not imagine Mzala, even though I don't know him, Ausmpo. But the scholar, the author, the intellectual he was, wherever he is tonight, he is pleased with what's going on. So thank you so much for reminding us of things we were just about to forget, if not forgotten. However, it is not mine to respond, and I know that everybody is exploding. I've heard he's and hi's behind me, and next to me, the council member, Mr. Baleni, is itching to ask questions and all of that. But I'm sure we will give time to Professor Dlovu Kateni, who also, can somebody reflect the bio? I'm sure you've seen that too, of the Achima Feje Institute, to come and give us his response to what Professor Marwala said, because that can't be ignored as well, and also to what Professor Sheehan has said. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to respond to this interesting lecture. If I nasalize some of the words, it's not that I try to speak like somebody else. I have some cold, which is actually demobilizing me. But I will try to pull through. Helena, thank you so much for the lecture. What is interesting about the lecture is that it is very timely in this country and in this continent, in the global south, and also, I think, at the international level. The subject of the lecture focuses on the issue of subjectivity, class, race, gender, and knowledge production. And that is the question which is preoccupying us here on a daily basis. And I agreed to come and respond, not because I'm a Marxist. I came to respond because I'm actually involved in some of the struggles which are taking place here and the attempts to transform the universities. So if my bias actually moves that direction, then you must understand that that is where I'm standing at the moment. You will agree with me that there is the return, the resurgence, and the insurgence of decolonization, and some call it decoloniality at the universities in this country. And I'm certain that if Mzala was alive, he would have participated effectively in this debate. Because if indeed he was part of the generation of 1976, and that generation raised one of the questions which is still with us today, which is the question of the language of instruction, the language of research, and the language of learning. And they were still struggling to actually get it right around that issue. The second aspect, which I think also makes your lecture very relevant to be a part of the memory of Mzala, is that this question of transformation of the universities, I think we need to put it clearly at the center of the national question in this country. It is actually part and parcel of the South African national question, a question which preoccupied Mzala in a big way. But I will move the academics, like politicians, once they are given a mic, they tend to deliver another lecture. But I will try not to do that. I will try to respond to what I think is very important. I know there is a sensitive question which people are skating around here. And that question is the question, Mzala was a committed Marxist-Leninist, and Helena also comes from that ideological background. And what is important then for us tonight, and I don't have an answer, but I need to actually put it forward very clearly, is that it is important to reflect on the question of ideology at this time. The ideology informing the present struggles, spearheaded mainly by the youth and the students. And what is the implication of the lack of ideology for subjectivity and knowledge? We have spoken about Rhodes must fall and the fees must fall. And the Rhodes must fall and fees must fall, from my reading, they openly said they were informed by Stephen Bantu Biko's Black Consciousness. And they also said they were informed by Frantz Fanoni's Decolonization as their ideological resources. And I'm not sure how that sits with Marxism. I will try to argue my own case. I want to posit that Marxism-Leninism, as you said, was actually an important ideological resource for the decolonization. The people who were involved in the liberation struggle, they never shunned Marxism-Leninism. They actually used it as a resource for decolonization. And I thought in your lecture you were going to raise an important question, particularly about what I will call black Marxists. The black Marxists, and I was talking to one of the people who are more senior than me in terms of age, who lived during the time of Fanon. And one day when we were having a seminar, one of them said, I was with Fanon in Accra in the 60s, and Fanon was a Marxist. But I think what actually became important to me when I was then reading Fanon, I think Fanon was actually arguing that we needed to stretch Marx so that Marx can be relevant to the issues taking place, for lack of a better word, in the peripheries and the sites of colonial domination. And I think a number of black Marxists' contribution was that indeed we accept Marxism-Leninism, but it needs to be indigenized. And I think Mzala also participated in that type of debate. The other important thing which I thought maybe you could have raised, the critique of Marxism is always that it privileges class over race. I've been reading, mainly my interest has always been on the black Marxists. And one of the black Marxists, Cedric Robinson, wrote this important book, Racial Capitalism. That when you are studying capitalism in the periphery, you will need really to underscore the issue of race. But those are my few reflections, but what I want to go straight into is the issue of the questions which you raised. The important questions which you raised a number of questions which I think you flagged them there. In the canonical narrative about the history of knowledge, who are the players? I work from the decolonization perspective. And the decolonization perspective tells us that the key thinkers in modern knowledge are from 5 countries: Italy, England, Germany, US, and that those thinkers from the 5 countries are basically male. And you raise the question again, who are the insiders and the outsiders? What happens when the outsiders start to come inside? I think that's an important question in the sense that we're not going to have Rhodes must fall, fees must fall, if it was not for the definitive entry of the descendants of the enslaved, the colonized, the racialized within the current universities. It was when these people entered the universities that then they discovered that, but this is not my home. There is alienation within the university. There is another culture within the university. Sometimes even your names will never be pronounced properly throughout your studies during the university time. And I think this question of saying who are the outsiders, it becomes very important. And you ask the question, is it enough to include those who have been excluded? I think my answer will be very simple. It is not enough. One of the major problems with the current attempts to transform the universities is the additive approach. Let's just add Steve Biko. Let's just add this. But the question which is never asked, which is a deeper question, is adding them to what? That is the question which actually is preoccupying us at the moment, to saying, but we're adding them to what? And if you are doing it from a historical perspective, you will discover that in the 60s, in the 70s, there was an attempt through what was called Africanization to add African scholars, African thinkers into what was existing. And the ball game by then, as far as I'm concerned, was actually I wanted to be part of the game. And I think we've passed that stage at the moment. We're no longer actually wanting to be added. We're actually questioning the rules of the game themselves. So that would be my response to that one. Can the academic disciplines be transformed? I will answer that one later. But I thought the questions will be very important. And then you asked the question about how did we come to be where we are? I think when I was reading your paper, I thought we need to define the present crisis facing us. And the way I thought about it, I thought about, the more deep I tried to think about it, two things came into mind. The systemic crisis, which from a Marxist perspective would be the crisis of capitalism. But there is also an epistemic crisis, which is the crisis of the irrelevance of the knowledge which has been dominant for over 500 years. What do we do with that? And it is these two crises from where I stand, which leads us to then struggle for what, for lack of a better term, I would call cognitive justice. And the cognitive justice here, we're talking about this refusal to recognize the diverse ways of knowing through which different people make sense of the world and their lives. And throughout your lecture, you also raised an important question, and that is the question of the division of labor. And I want to try to speak about it in terms of division of intellectual labor. And I think that is an important question for us today, in the sense that you will hear people speaking about global economy of knowledge. But you can't talk about African knowledge, you can't talk about Asian knowledge, you can't talk about Caribbean knowledge, you can't talk about that. You must actually talk about a global economy of knowledge. But the critique is that even if we speak that way, what is visible is that there is still a center from which, let me use this word, from which what is recognized as valuable knowledge circulates. And that still remains to be Europe and North America. And I'm not here actually using my own words, I'm actually using the work of an African philosopher, Pauline Ntonji, who really went into depth about this issue of the global economy of knowledge, where he said, in this division of labor, in this intellectual division of labor, Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Caribbean, and all those who have been actually colonized, they remain hunting and gathering spaces for raw data. And what happens after you have gathered the raw data is that it is then processed into theory in the North. And what then happens is that we then consume that theory, this side. And he says, in this uneven division of labor, African scholars, more than anything else, they become native informants. And he goes further to say, if we agree with this type of analysis, then the problem of today is the problem of intellectual dependence. For theory, we really depend on Marx, we depend on Gramsci, we depend on Michel Foucault, we depend, and we have a lot of surnames here of people calling themselves Gramscians, calling themselves Marxists, calling themselves Derridians, and that, according to Paul Ntonji, is the problem of dependency. You are depending on the thinking of other people. And then there is a practical problem in all this, which affects me and affects most of the academics who are seated here. And this problem is the problem whereby when you want to publish your work, when you want to be recognized as a scholar, you need to know where to publish. And where is that where we publish? You need to actually choose the journals and the presses which are actually in the North in order for you to be recognized. And then that, to me, actually amplifies that Untonji's analysis might actually be correct. If I can move forward, and you asked the question, how did it come to be? I think two issues come to mind. Of course, the obvious one is colonialism. And when we're thinking about colonialism, I think it would be important for us for people to understand why we continue to talk about colonialism 60 years after the so-called decolonization, or 65 years, or 70 years. Why do we continue to talk about colonialism? I think one thing for analytical purposes, we need to distinguish between physical empire on the one end, cognitive empire on another end, and the commercial empire. When Kwame Nkrumah was speaking about seek ye the political kingdom and all other things will be added unto it, fundamentally he was speaking about the physical empire. But it was Nkrumah himself who corrected himself by 1965 by saying, yeah, but there is still neo-colonialism, and they coined the word neo-colonialism. And that's why I was talking about black Marxists, because he accepted that he was a Marxist, and he coined the concept of neo-colonialism, which today has been extended to the issue of coloniality. And the second one, which I think is important, I think you touched on this one, is the problem of corporatization, capitalist corporatization, where you turn universities into corporate enterprises, where the professors are actually undergoing what we call proletarianization, casualization and heavy workloads, and where the issue of love for knowledge is not what is privilege. What is privilege is the quantity of what you produce, the numbers of the publications which you produce, and some have actually spoken about it. Mamdani wrote a book which actually speaks about the university becoming a marketplace. And in a marketplace, you will have problems whereby people want the diplomas, the degrees, but they don't like the knowledge itself. And I think that's the problem which we need to confront. Let me move again very fast. You spoke again about the problem, how the impact of neoliberal capitalism has actually affected us as intellectuals. And I think one of the very consistent Marxist leftist, Issa G. Shivji, put it this way. He said, because of the corporatization, the majority of African intellectuals have pretty well accommodated mainstream thought. This includes former militant nationalists, radical socialist intellectuals, the metamorphosis of African intellectuals from a revolutionary to an activist, from critical economist to postmodernist, from a social analyst to constitutional liberal, from anti-imperialist to cultural atavist, from radical economics professor to a neoliberal World Bank spokesperson, from an intellectual to a consultant, is blatant, unrepentant, and a reactionary. So he was actually summarizing the consequences of. But the next issue arising from your questions is, how do we characterize the crisis facing the university today? I tried to scratch my head to say, how do we name? You talked about Marxism naming the system. They named it as capitalism. But we needed to name also the crisis facing the university today. And for lack of a better word, I went to the work of Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, who actually says the university today is facing a triple crisis. Triple crisis, and he said the first crisis facing the university is the crisis of hegemony. And by that, he meant the functions of the university themselves are being contested. And the idea that a university is there to produce high culture, elitism, universal knowledge is challenged by those who are saying the university must actually privilege relevance, social justice, and empowerment. Then there's a second characterization of crisis, which Bonaventura put it as the crisis of legitimacy. And I think you spoke about that one. And that one is the issue whereby you find universities have been complicit with the slavery, they've been complicit with racism, they've been complicit with colonialism, with patriarchy, with epistemicide, linguicides. And once they face that type of crisis, then the last one is the institutional crisis. I think during your generation, the issue of being an ivory tower, being autonomous, was very important. But at the moment, they are saying, but the university needs not to be an ivory tower. It actually needs to be socially embedded, and it must be socially responsible. I don't want to talk about the Rhodes must fall. I think we have covered it. But what is important about Rhodes must fall is that I think we need to read them deeper than the issue of the stage. I think one of the questions which are rising, if you look at them in totality, is that there is one issue which emerges immediately. And this is the question of saying, do we have African universities in South Africa? Or we have universities in Africa? I think that's an important question which we need to deal with. The university can be here, but is it of here? That's an issue which we need to and what does it mean to have a university of here, rather than a university which is located here but is from elsewhere? And then the other issue which they raised, I think that one became very obvious, is the issue of decommissioning of the offensive apartheid symbols, statues, and names. I think that one was obvious. And then the issue of the funding of higher education. I think you put the Freedom Charter there, the walls will be opened. And I think that one, they also put it very open. But the other thing which they put forward very clearly is the issue of the language of teaching, research, and learning. What do we do? Should we continue using English and the other languages? And that question becomes very useful because it goes back to some of the issues which you raised. Do we just remove English, then put indigenous languages? What do we do? And today, we're faced with that practical question. And what is happening, people are using some other very funny methodologies to arrive at the resolution of that question, whereby they formulate questionnaires, which they then distribute to the students. Do you want it to be taught in Zulu, or in isiXhosa, or Tswana, or Venda? Then they say 60% of the students said they want to be taught in English. But the question is, you are asking a wrong question in the first place, which makes people answer it that way. People think it's an issue of saying, today the only language which I'm going to be taught, the language which I know is English already. So I've always been trying to say, but in the questionnaire we need to ask the right questions so that people understand what we're asking. Because where I'm located, there was that question, and the questionnaire came with this answer that 60% of the people said they don't want indigenous languages. They want to continue to be taught in English. Then the other important one, I think you talked about this one, is the issue of knowledge and curriculum. And I will end by reflecting on that. And the last one, which I think Marxism assisted us a lot, is the issue of class oppression. You know, with the Rhodes must fall, it came under another name, outsourcing. And it's interesting because in different universities, Rhodes must fall and fees must fall manifested itself differently. If at Rhodes you had a statue, you can't expect us at UNISA to fight against a statue which does not exist. So what happened is that if you read the student movements, at UNISA, the question was actually the labor question. It was not about the statue. As I conclude, I think is that Leninist Marxist question, what is to be done? And you put some of the ways forward. I think the debates are very complex here. There is a rich archive which has emerged in terms of what the transformation should entail. One of the questions is that, of course, people speak about Eurocentrism as the problem. But if you just say Eurocentrism, you need to unpack what you mean by Eurocentrism. And the simplest way to do it is that Eurocentrism manifests itself in terms of overrepresentation of European thought in theory, in education, in everything we do. And the issue is, what do we do? And you said, we don't need to throw everything away. We need to find creative ways of doing it. From Latin America and the Caribbean, they speak about shifting the geography and the biography of knowledge. And there are some who are saying, agreeing with you in that instead of remove and replace, why don't we expand the shoulders on which we stand? Instead, in sociology, of standing on Max Weber, Karl Marx, Durkheim, why don't you expand to thinkers from Asia, thinkers from this country, and the thinkers from elsewhere? Then secondly, you raised the question about the disciplines. What do we do about the disciplines? Some saying there is disciplinary decadence. There is a book already written by Louis Aragotten, Disciplinary Decadence. And the issue is, if you go to the work of Michel Foucault, for instance, Michel Foucault will straightforward say, modern disciplines emerge in modern history for a particular reason. And they emerged in order to resolve particular problems. And the question for us today, are these disciplines still relevant? That is the question which is facing us today. Should we not go back to the constitutive formation of the disciplines? Should we not ask their fitness for purpose? Should we not ask the questions of their relevance? Should those who are paying for the disciplines, should they not ask for the value for money? And then the other issue which I think is very important is how do we react? I've spoken about Gramscian theory, Marxist, and all these other theories. What do we do? Should we not actually adopt a decolonial critique of the foundations of these theories, their normative foundation? And when I'm talking about the normative foundation, I'm here thinking about a theory which is coming from this norm which says there is progress, there is development, there is emancipation, that linearity of thinking. It has implications for theory. And then you remember, those who are reading Edward Said, his critique of the Frankfurt School was that what the Frankfurt School is saying is critical theory, but it never actually talks about imperialism, colonialism, and slavery. And he said why they are not doing that is because of the normative foundation. If we are thinking about the world from idea of progress, development, emancipation, then imperialism, colonialism appears like development. Then the last one, which I want to end, is what do we do to ourselves as products of the modern universities? The person who is speaking in front of you here is a product of the modern university. Am I not the problem myself? And what do I do to myself? I think with that, I will then go and sit down. Thank you so much.
Everyone just got us very excited this evening. It started with Professor Marwala, agitating about the transformation. Actually, I think the theme is that, and how do we do that? Of course, he's talking about the cooking of the rice inside and outside, doing it, at the same time and so on. And Professor Helena is also talking about the insiders and those that are excluded and the issue of who holds the center. And then Professor Galcheni now comes and just kind of says, is Marxism as relevant as it was?
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.